Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart had one of the most astonishing and action-filled lives of the 20th century. Born into aristocracy, he abandoned a life of comfort for the chaos of the battlefield, starting a military career that would span 6 decades and 3 major conflicts: the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War. He was a frontline commander who seemed to attract bullets, yet he faced every life-threatening injury with a stoicism and, remarkably, a sense of good cheer that baffled those around him. Winston Churchill, who was a personal friend, once described him as a model of chivalry and honor. Others simply knew him as the unkillable soldier. In this episode, we look at the life of Adrian Carton de Wiart. We will trace his journey from a young man lying about his age to fight in South Africa to the muddy trenches of the Western Front, where he lost an eye and a hand but gained a Victoria Cross. We'll follow him to Poland, where he fought the Bolsheviks, and see how, even in his 60s, he was still on the front lines of World War II. This is the story of a man who embodied resilience, saw more combat than a dozen ordinary soldiers, and whose own summary of his life was a masterpiece of understatement. Today, we explore the life, the legend, and the indomitable spirit of the unkillable soldier. Part 1. The Forging of a Warrior. Adrian Carton de Wiart was born in Brussels on May 5, 1880, into a world of aristocracy and privilege. His father, Leon, was a prominent Belgian lawyer and magistrate, and his mother was of Irish descent. There were even whispers and rumors at the time that he might have been an illegitimate son of the Belgian king, Leopold II. While that was never proven, it adds another layer of intrigue to a life that hardly needs it. His early years were divided between Belgium and England. Tragedy struck when he was only 6 years old. His mother passed away, and his father relocated the family to Cairo to practice international law. This move immersed young Adrian in a new and vibrant culture, where he even learned to speak Arabic. The comforts of a wealthy life in Egypt were not destined to hold him. In 1891, his English stepmother sent him to a boarding school in England, the prestigious Oratory School, and from there he went on to study law at Balliol College, Oxford. Carton de Wiart was not cut out for the quiet life of a student or a lawyer. He was restless, filled with a craving for adventure that the hallowed halls of Oxford could never satisfy. In his own words, he wanted to live life rough and tough and full of bitter experiences. He had a romantic, almost naive, view of conflict. He later wrote, "I know that the ideal soldier is the man who fights for his country because it is fighting, and for no other reason. Causes, politics, and ideologies are better left to the historians." This profound, almost detached thirst for action would define the rest of his life. He even considered that if the British wouldn't have him, he'd just as soon have offered his services to their enemies, the Boers. In 1899, that thirst became impossible to ignore. The Second Boer War had broken out in South Africa, a distant conflict that called to him like a siren song. There were several problems, however. He was only 19 or 20, under the official military age for service. He was not yet a British subject, and he certainly did not have the consent of his father, who believed his son was diligently studying law. None of these obstacles mattered. Carton de Wiart simply walked away from his studies, went to a recruiting office, and lied. He gave a false name, Trooper Carton, and claimed to be 25 years old. Just like that, the young aristocrat vanished, and a soldier was born. He sailed for South Africa to serve with a unit called Paget's Horse. The reality of modern warfare was a stark contrast to his romantic imaginings. He quickly discovered the brutal effectiveness of entrenched positions and barbed wire. In one instance, displaying the kind of reckless bravery that would become his trademark, he volunteered for a near-suicidal mission to dash forward under fire and cut the wire that was holding up an advance. His commanding officer wisely denied the request, calling him a fool and, in doing so, likely saved his life. De Wiart was disappointed, later writing, "War was still eluding me, and my vivid imaginings of charging Boers single-handed and dying gloriously were becoming a little hazy." He wouldn't have to wait long for the war to find him. During one engagement, he was shot in the stomach and the groin. The severe wounds meant his time in South Africa was over, at least for now. He was invalided and sent back home to England. This unceremonious return led to two significant revelations. First, the army discovered his true identity and age. Second, and far more consequentially, his father discovered that his son had abandoned a prestigious university for a war on another continent. His father was, by all accounts, furious. One might expect this traumatic experience, being severely wounded and then facing the wrath of his powerful father, to have cured him of his desire for a military life. For Carton de Wiart, it did the exact opposite. He wrote in his memoir that after his first taste of combat, "At that moment, I knew once and for all that war was in my blood." The experience had not broken his spirit, it had forged it. The thrill, the danger, the sheer intensity of it all had resonated with something deep inside him. His father, seeing this unshakable determination, eventually relented and allowed his son to pursue the career he so desperately wanted. After a brief, token return to Oxford, de Wiart secured a regular commission in the army. In 1901, he was back in South Africa, this time as a legitimate second lieutenant in the 4th Dragoon Guards. The war was nearing its end, but his career was just beginning. This first chapter of his life, defined by rebellion, a lust for adventure, and a brutal introduction to the costs of war, was merely the prologue. The serious injuries he sustained in the Boer War were the first of many, the opening notes in a symphony of survival that would echo across the battlefields of the 20th century. He had been wounded, but he was far from broken. He had found his calling. Part 2. The First World War. After the Boer War, Adrian Carton de Wiart's career settled into the more predictable rhythm of a peacetime soldier. He served in India for several years, a posting that was a mix of polo, big game hunting, and the general duties of an officer in the British Empire. He became aide-de-camp to the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Henry Wilson, a role that placed him in the upper echelons of military society. Eager to get to the Western Front, he boarded a ship for France. The ship was torpedoed in the Bay of Biscay. He escaped, of course, and finally arrived at the front lines in the spring of 1915, just in time for the Second Battle of Ypres. He was given command of a battalion, and it was here that he would suffer the second of his iconic injuries. During the intense fighting, his left hand was shattered by German artillery fire. His transition into the Great War began in the arid landscape of East Africa. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, he was on his way back to England from Somaliland. Instead of continuing home, he was immediately ordered to join the Somaliland Camel Corps, a unit fighting against the forces of the dervish leader Mohammed bin Abdullah, often called the Mad Mullah. It was here, in 1915, during an attack on an enemy fort, that Carton de Wiart's legendary reputation for surviving catastrophic injuries truly began. As he led the charge, he was struck by 2 bullets. One hit him in the arm, the other ripped through his face, taking out his left eye and a piece of his ear. He was sent to a hospital to recover, but his only concern was getting back to the action. When a fellow officer visited, he found Carton de Wiart pacing the room in frustration, desperate to be discharged. The loss of an eye, which would be a career-ending, life-altering event for anyone else, was a mere inconvenience to him. He later wrote in his memoir, "I was destined to lose an eye, and I was not in the least bit sorry, as it was a bloody nuisance and had been the bane of my life." He found that the black eye patch he would wear for the rest of his life was actually an improvement. This astonishing lack of self-pity, this almost cheerful acceptance of grievous injury, was pure Carton de Wiart. The legend of the unkillable soldier was taking root. Eager to get to the Western Front, he boarded a ship for France. The ship was torpedoed in the Bay of Biscay. He escaped, of course, and finally arrived at the front lines in the spring of 1915, just in time for the Second Battle of Ypres. He was given command of a battalion, and it was here that he would suffer the second of his iconic injuries. During the intense fighting, his left hand was shattered by German artillery fire. He was evacuated to a casualty clearing station where a doctor, seeing the mangled mess, refused to amputate any of the fingers immediately. According to the story that has become legendary, Carton de Wiart, seeing no use for the ruined digits and in considerable pain, simply pulled off 2 of his own fingers and threw them away. Later, a surgeon would formally remove the entire hand. Again, this would have been the end of any other soldier's war. For Carton de Wiart, it was just another wound to overcome. He was fitted with a prosthetic hand, but found it clumsy and useless, often leaving it behind in taxis or restaurants. He preferred to simply live with one hand, tucking the empty sleeve of his uniform into his pocket. His focus remained singular. Get back to the fighting. Within months, he was back in France, leading men in the trenches. What followed was a litany of injuries so extensive it sounds like a statistical impossibility. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, a campaign infamous for its horrific casualties, he was commanding the 8th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment. While going over the top at a place called La Boiselle, he was shot through the back of the skull. The bullet passed straight through his head. Miraculously, it missed his spinal cord and brainstem, and he survived. He was knocked unconscious but was soon back on his feet, albeit after another period of recovery. For most people, a gunshot wound to the head is a fatal event. For Carton de Wiart, it was just another scar. The war machine ground on, and so did he. At the Battle of Passchendaele, a name synonymous with mud, misery, and death, he was shot through the hip. At the Battle of Cambrai, he was shot through the leg. During another engagement, a bullet tore through his ear. He was a magnet for enemy fire, always leading from the front, seemingly indifferent to the mortal danger that surrounded him. His men were in awe of him. He was in the thick of it, sharing their risks, and his incredible resilience in the face of constant injury gave him a near-mythical status. He seemed to be made of something else entirely. His courage was not just about surviving injury, it was about his leadership in the heat of battle. In 1916, at La Boiselle on the Somme, his bravery was so extraordinary that it earned him the Victoria Cross, the highest and most prestigious award for gallantry in the face of the enemy that can be awarded in the British military. The official citation reads like a scene from an action movie. On July 2, 1916, the battle was raging, and enemy fire was relentless. 3 other battalion commanders had become casualties. In the chaos and confusion, Carton de Wiart, seeing the situation deteriorating, took control. He moved among his men with absolute calmness, completely exposed to machine gun and rifle fire. His citation notes his most conspicuous bravery, coolness, and determination. When the flank of his battalion was exposed, he personally led the charge to secure it. When the attack was checked, he rallied his men and pushed forward. On 3 separate occasions that day, he personally went out into no man's land to cut the wires holding up the advance, a task that was essentially a death sentence. His utter disregard for his own safety was breathtaking. He inspired his troops, steadied them in the face of terrifying losses, and turned a potential disaster into a success. He was a whirlwind of action, a one-eyed, one-handed commander who refused to be stopped by anything the enemy could throw at him. By the end of the First World War, de Wiart had been wounded, a total of 8 times. He had lost an eye and a hand, been shot through the skull, hip, leg, ankle, and ear. He had survived a plane crash and a shipwreck. He had earned the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and was mentioned in dispatches 6 times. He was a testament to the horrors of industrial warfare, yet he carried his wounds as a matter of course. When the armistice was finally signed, his reflection on the conflict was characteristically understated. He simply wrote, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war. Part 3. Between the Wars, A Soldier's Peace. When the armistice was declared on November 11, 1918, a profound and unfamiliar silence fell over the Western Front. For 4 years, Europe had moved to the rhythm of artillery, and for men like Adrian Carton de Wiart, the sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise had ever been. He was a creature of the battlefield, a man who had not only survived its horrors, but had, in his own unique way, thrived on its intensity. The question that hung in the air for millions of soldiers was, what now? For Carton de Wiart, a man who had given an eye and a hand to the war effort, the world was broken and being remade, and on the new, chaotic map of Europe, a new conflict was already brewing. His next chapter began with a journey east. In 1919, he was appointed as the second in command, and later the head of the British military mission to Poland. Poland was a nation resurrected. For 123 years, it had ceased to exist as an independent state, carved up and absorbed by its powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Treaty of Versailles had put Poland back on the map, but it was a fragile, vulnerable creation surrounded by predators. To the west lay a defeated but resentful Germany. To the east, a far more immediate and existential threat was emerging from the ashes of the Russian Empire. The Bolshevik Revolution had succeeded, and Vladimir Lenin's Red Army was not content with victory at home. Their goal was a world revolution, to spread the fire of communism across the continent. Poland, in their view, was not a country but a red bridge that the revolution must cross to reach the industrial heartlands of Germany and the rest of Europe. The newly formed Polish state was, therefore, the first line of defense against this ideological tide. The British government, deeply fearful of Bolshevism's spread, saw a strong, independent Poland as essential. Carton de Wiart's mission was to provide advice, supplies, and a visible symbol of British support to the fledgling Polish army. He arrived in a Warsaw buzzing with the chaotic energy of nation-building. It was a city of immense patriotism and immense anxiety. Here, he met the man who was the living embodiment of Poland's fight for freedom, Marshal Józef Piłsudski. Piłsudski was a former revolutionary, a brilliant military strategist, and Poland's undisputed leader. He was a tough, pragmatic, and uncompromising figure who, like Carton de Wiart, had dedicated his life to the profession of arms. The two men, the one-eyed British general and the grizzled Polish marshal, forged a powerful connection built on mutual respect. They understood each other. They were soldiers who spoke the direct language of action, not the flowery prose of diplomacy. Carton de Wiart was supposed to be an advisor, an observer watching from the sidelines. That was a role he was temperamentally incapable of playing. The Polish-Soviet War, which had been simmering since early 1919, soon erupted into a full-scale invasion. The conflict was vastly different from the static trench warfare he had known in France. This was a war of movement, of sweeping cavalry charges and rapid advances across vast open plains. It was brutal, chaotic, and ideological. He knew he could not understand it from an office in Warsaw. So, he took to the skies. He began flying as an observer on reconnaissance missions with Polish pilots, wanting to see the disposition of the Red Army for himself. This immediately put him back in the familiar territory of mortal danger. On one flight, his plane was shot down over Lithuania. He and his pilot were captured by Lithuanian forces who were in a state of conflict with Poland at the time. For a moment, it seemed his war was over. Carton de Wiart, using a combination of his high rank and sheer force of personality, managed to talk his way out of captivity and make his way back to Poland. Soon after, it happened again. This time, his plane was forced down behind the Soviet front lines. He and his Polish companions found themselves deep in enemy territory, with Red Army patrols all around them. What followed was a desperate, days-long trek back to safety, fighting off enemy patrols and living off the land. For a man in his 40s with one eye and one hand, it was a remarkable feat of endurance that only added to the mystique that surrounded him. By the summer of 1920, the situation had become dire. The Red Army, under the command of the brilliant but ruthless Mikhail Tukhachevsky, had smashed through the Polish defenses and was now advancing on Warsaw itself. A sense of doom fell over the capital. Foreign embassies packed their bags, burning documents and preparing for a hasty evacuation. The governments of Europe watched on, believing the fall of Poland was inevitable. Most of the British military mission prepared to leave. Carton de Wiart refused to go. As the diplomatic corps fled, he remained. He was seen walking the streets of Warsaw, his uniform immaculate, a revolver tucked into his belt, a reassuringly calm presence amidst the growing panic. He did more than just watch. When he heard that a crucial armored train was being sent to the front lines, he decided his place was on it. He joined the Polish crew, and from the train's steel-plated carriages, he personally engaged in a firefight with attacking Red Army cavalry. It was an astonishing act for a senior foreign military attaché, a complete breach of diplomatic neutrality. A fight was on, and his instinct was to join it, not to observe it. His defiance was a mirror of the Polish spirit. Against all expectations, Marshal Piłsudski orchestrated a brilliant and daring counterattack. In what would forever be known as the miracle on the Vistula, the Polish army, fighting for its very existence, encircled and decimated the advancing Soviet forces. The Red Army was beaten, the tide was turned, and Poland was saved. The Red Bridge to Europe had been destroyed. Carton de Wiart had witnessed this moment of national triumph firsthand, and it solidified a deep and abiding love for Poland and its people. When the war officially ended with the Peace of Riga in 1921, Carton de Wiart's mission was over. He was formally retired from the British Army 2 years later, in 1923, with the rank of Major General. He was a decorated hero, a living legend. The logical next step was a comfortable retirement in England. But logic had never been his guiding principle. He had found a new home. He decided to stay in Poland. He acquired a huge estate called Prosty, located in the Pripyat Marshes. The Pripyat Marshes, a vast wetland region on the border of modern-day Poland, Belarus and Ukraine, was one of the last true wildernesses in Europe. It was a sprawling, untamed landscape of rivers, forests, bogs and swamps, teeming with wildlife. For a man who craved a life rough and tough, it was paradise. He purchased the estate, a former hunting lodge of a Polish prince, and for the next 15 years he lived what he considered to be the happiest days of his life. His retirement was anything but retiring. His days were filled with relentless physical activity. He rose early and spent his time hunting wild boar, shooting ducks, and fishing in the rivers. It was a life that required immense stamina and skill, a constant challenge against the elements that suited him perfectly. He hosted friends from England and Poland who would come to experience the unique and rugged hospitality of the one-eyed general in his marshland kingdom. His wife and 2 daughters joined him there, adapting to a life that was a world away from the aristocratic circles of London or Vienna. This long, peaceful interlude was the eye of the storm. As he hunted and fished through the late 1920s and 1930s, the world beyond his wild paradise was growing darker. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, their ambitions set on overturning the Treaty of Versailles and expanding German territory. To the east, Joseph Stalin was consolidating his iron grip on the Soviet Union, a power that had not forgotten its defeat at the gates of Warsaw. Poland, the country Carton de Wiart had adopted as his own, was once again caught in the middle, trapped between 2 monstrously ambitious totalitarian regimes. He watched with growing unease as Hitler rearmed the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and then set his sights on Czechoslovakia. The appeasement policies of Britain and France did nothing to stop the march of aggression. Then, in August of 1939, the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, bitter ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. Its secret protocols contained a plan to once again carve up Poland between them. The trap was set. The idyllic peace of the Pripyat Marshes was about to be shattered. The longest period of quiet Carton de Wiart had ever known was over. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world was once again plunged into war. Part 4. The Second World War. On September 1st, 1939, the long peace that Adrian Carton de Wiart had cherished in his Polish marshland paradise was violently shattered. The sound of German bombers roaring overhead replaced the familiar call of wild birds. The Second World War had begun, and his adopted home was its first victim. As the Wehrmacht blitzed through Poland from the west and, just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Red Army invaded from the east, his estate at Prosty was directly in the path of the onslaught. The idyll was over. He was forced to flee, escaping with his family through Romania, leaving behind the home and the life he had loved for nearly 2 decades. He was now a refugee, but he was also a soldier. At nearly 60 years of age, with 1 eye, 1 hand, and a body riddled with old wounds, his only thought was to get back to Britain and get back in the fight. After a difficult journey, he arrived back in England. The British Army, however, was initially unsure of what to do with him. He was a decorated hero from a previous war, but he was also officially retired and well past the age for a field command. For a few months, he was left in a state of frustrating inactivity during the period that became known as the Phony War. But Carton de Wiart was not a man to be left on a shelf. He lobbied relentlessly for a command, and his old friend, the newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, made sure he got one. In April of 1940, the old lion was let out of his cage. He was given the command of a force being sent to Norway. The situation was desperate. Nazi Germany had launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway to secure vital iron ore routes and naval bases. The Allies scrambled to respond, throwing together an expeditionary force to try and counter the German advance. Carton de Wiart was tasked with leading a hastily assembled Anglo-French force, codenamed Sickle Force, with the objective of capturing the key port city of Trondheim. It was a mission plagued with problems from the very start. The troops were a mix of territorial units, poorly equipped and with no training for Arctic warfare. They lacked proper maps, artillery and, most critically, air support. His journey to Norway was a classic Carton de Wiart episode. He flew in on a Sunderland flying boat, which, unable to find a clear landing spot on the water, was forced to land on a frozen fjord. It was a risky maneuver that perfectly set the tone for the chaotic campaign to follow. On the ground, he found the situation was even worse than he had been briefed. His forces were outmatched and outmaneuvered. The German Luftwaffe had complete control of the skies, relentlessly bombing and strafing his positions. He later remarked, "The contending forces were so unequal that the campaign was a hopeless failure from the start." Yet, in the midst of this hopeless failure, his leadership was a beacon of stability. Just as he had done on the Somme a generation earlier, he led from the front, seemingly oblivious to the bombs and bullets. He was a constant, visible presence among his men, projecting an aura of unflappable calm in the face of overwhelming odds. One soldier recalled seeing him strolling through a heavily bombed town, his black eye patch and empty sleeve a familiar silhouette, as if he were merely taking an afternoon walk. Though he could not conjure victory from the jaws of defeat, he conducted the campaign with skill and courage, and when the order finally came to evacuate, he organized a masterful withdrawal, saving his force from annihilation. He was one of the last men to leave Norwegian soil. His next assignment came in 1941. He was chosen to head a British military mission to another country under threat, Yugoslavia. He set off from England in a Wellington bomber, charting a course across the Mediterranean. His legendary bad luck with airplanes was about to strike again. Over the coast of Libya, which was then an Italian colony, one of the plane's engines failed. Then the other sputtered and died. The bomber was going down. It crashed into the sea, miles from shore. Carton de Wiart, now 61 years old, was knocked unconscious by the impact. He came to in the cold, dark water inside the sinking fuselage. He managed to struggle free and swim to the surface, where he found the rest of the surviving crew clinging to the wreckage. For the one-eyed, one-handed general, it was just another day at the office. He calmly helped organize the survivors and then began the long swim towards the distant shore. He was captured by Italian forces almost as soon as he dragged himself onto the beach. He was now a prisoner of war. Because of his rank and fame, he was considered the premio grosso, a big prize. He was sent to a special camp for high-ranking officers, a formidable fortress-like villa near Florence called the Castello di Vinciliata. Here, he joined a distinguished group of captive generals and air marshals. The Italians treated them with a degree of correctness, but for a man like Carton de Wiart, captivity was an intolerable state. His war was not over. It had just entered a new phase. He immediately took on the role of senior British officer, and his primary mission became clear: escape. He would later claim to have made at least 7 separate escape attempts. He tried to climb down the castle walls. He disguised himself as an Italian peasant, a laughable attempt given his unmistakable appearance. He spent 4 months pretending to be crippled by his old leg wound, hobbling around on a stick, hoping to be repatriated on medical grounds, a plan that was only foiled when he was caught accidentally jumping onto a wall to watch a football match. His most audacious effort, however, was a classic of the genre. He and several other generals, men in their 50s and 60s, decided to dig a tunnel. For 7 months, this group of senior officers who had once commanded armies worked like moles. They chiseled through the solid rock floor of a chapel within the castle using makeshift tools. The work was slow, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous. They had to dispose of the rubble without arousing the suspicion of their guards. They worked in shifts, day after day, in secret. In March of 1943, the tunnel was finally complete. One night, he and 6 other men slipped out into the darkness. Carton de Wiart, now 63 years old, disguised himself as a peasant, put a mattress on his head to look like he was moving house, and simply walked out into the Italian countryside. He was on the run for 8 days, an incredible feat for a man of his age and physical condition, especially one who did not speak a word of Italian. He was eventually recaptured, cold and hungry, in a train station, his quest for freedom foiled by his inability to produce a valid ticket. His return to the castle was not the end of his story as a prisoner. In fact, it was the prelude to its most bizarre chapter. By August of 1943, the war had turned decisively against Italy. Mussolini had been overthrown, and the new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, was secretly looking for a way out of the war. They decided to make a clandestine approach to the Allies to negotiate a surrender. They needed a trusted intermediary, someone the British would listen to. In a twist of fate that could only happen in a life like his, they decided to send their most famous prisoner. One day, Carton de Wiart was abruptly taken from his cell. He was given a hot bath, a shave, and a brand new civilian suit. The commander of the prison camp then informed him that the Italian government was releasing him. Not only that, they wanted him to travel with an Italian negotiator to Lisbon, where he was to present their surrender terms to the Allied representatives. It was a surreal turn of events. One moment, he was a prisoner digging tunnels. The next, he was an unofficial diplomat on a mission to end a nation's war. He accepted the task, traveled to Lisbon, and played his part in the complex negotiations that led to Italy's capitulation. Freed from captivity, he returned to Britain. But his war was still not over. Winston Churchill had one final, crucial mission for him. He wanted to send a personal representative to the leader of nationalist China, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. It required a man of immense standing, military experience, and toughness. Churchill chose his old friend. So, in late 1943, Carton de Wiart set off for the Far East. The journey, predictably, involved yet another plane crash. While flying from India to China, over the notorious hump of the Himalayas, his plane lost its way in a storm and went down in the dense Burmese jungle. He survived, of course. After a difficult trek, he and the other survivors stumbled out of the jungle to be rescued, with Carton de Wiart reportedly looking more annoyed than distressed. He spent the remainder of the war in Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, navigating the complexity and frustrations of Chinese politics and military strategy. He was Churchill's eyes and ears, a link between the Western Allies and their powerful but mercurial Asian partner. He was there until the final days of the war, witnessing the defeat of Japan from the other side of the world. He had begun the war fleeing for his life from his home in Poland. He ended it as a respected diplomat in China. He had fought on the frozen fjords of Norway, been captured in the Mediterranean, escaped from a castle in Italy, and survived a crash in the Burmese jungle. Part 5. The Legacy of the Unkillable Soldier. When the Second World War finally ended in August of 1945, Adrian Carton de Wiart was now 65 years old, a veteran of 3 major wars spanning the dawn of the 20th century to the atomic age. For the first time in 6 years, the world was at peace, and for the final time in his long and violent career, the old soldier could finally go home. After a brief final posting as a government envoy to Burma, he returned to England. In 1947, he officially retired from the army for the second and last time. He was a celebrated figure, a living legend whose exploits were the stuff of barrack-room lore. What does a man who has lived such an impossibly action-packed life do when the music finally stops? His answer was to write about it. In 1950, he published his memoirs, giving them a title that perfectly encapsulated his extraordinary outlook on life: Happy Odyssey. The title itself is a window into his soul. For a man who had been shot, blown up, shipwrecked and imprisoned, whose body was a roadmap of scars from nearly a dozen major wounds, to describe his journey as a happy odyssey is a level of understatement that is almost breathtaking. The book is written exactly as he lived, directly, without fuss, and with a near-total absence of self-pity or introspection. He recounts events that would have traumatized any normal person with the same matter-of-fact tone he uses to describe a good day of duck shooting. The loss of his eye is dismissed as a bloody nuisance. The loss of his hand is dealt with in a few short sentences. He dedicates more ink to the specifics of salmon fishing than to the day he was shot through the back of the skull. Then there is the book's most famous and most revealing line. In summarizing his experience of the First World War, a conflict that consumed millions of lives and scarred the psyche of a generation, he wrote simply, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." This single sentence has come to define him, and it is easy to misinterpret. It was not the sentiment of a man who loved killing or destruction. Rather, it was the honest admission of a man who felt most alive when the stakes were at their absolute highest. He thrived on the challenge, camaraderie, and the clarity of purpose that combat provided. The complexities and ambiguities of civilian life, he found, were far more difficult to navigate than a battlefield. His Happy Odyssey was a testament to a spirit that found its truest expression in the face of extreme adversity. After the publication of his memoir, he felt that post-war England was too grey and constrained. The wild marshes of Poland he had loved were now lost forever behind the Iron Curtain. He needed a new sanctuary. He found it in Ireland, the land of his mother's birth. In 1951, he bought Argenau House, a grand Georgian home in County Cork, and settled there for the remainder of his days. Just as he had in Poland, he filled his days with activity. He became a passionate salmon fisherman, dedicating himself to the art of angling on the River Blackwater with the same focus he had once applied to military strategy. His home was always full of guests, and he was a renowned host, full of stories and a dry, understated wit. On June 5, 1963, Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart died peacefully at his home in Ireland. He was 83 years old. The man who had courted death on battlefields across the globe died of old age, surrounded by the peace he had so rarely known but had finally found. How do we define the legacy of such a man? He was, without question, a product of his time. He was an Edwardian aristocrat, imbued with a deep-seated sense of duty, honor, and a belief in the British Empire. He belonged to a class of men who viewed war as a noble, if dangerous, profession. His personal courage was never in doubt. Was it courage, or a form of supreme recklessness? The line is often thin. He never ordered a man to do something he was not prepared to do himself, and he was always at the front of the charge. This earned him the undying loyalty of his soldiers, but it also made him a magnet for bullets. He seemed to be completely oblivious to danger, his focus always locked on the objective. Perhaps his most remarkable quality was his mental and emotional fortitude. He possessed an almost supernatural cheerfulness. In a world of pain and trauma, he simply refused to complain. After tearing off his own fingers, he was said to be in good spirits shortly afterward. When he was fished out of the Mediterranean after a plane crash, his primary concern was that he had lost his uniform. This cheerful stoicism baffled doctors, fellow officers, and his captors. He treated his grievous wounds as inconveniences, his artificial hand the clumsy gadget to be discarded, his glass eye he used as a party trick. He simply did not possess the capacity for self-pity. In the end, Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart's life reads like a fictional adventure story, except every unbelievable chapter is true. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.